The Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, adopted by the UN in 2015, represent a major global initiative, serving as a shared blueprint for achieving peace, prosperity, and sustainability. And we are now more than halfway between 2015, when the SDGs were announced, and 2030, when they should be accomplished. But despite their immense importance and also substantial investment, the SDGs have thus far fallen short of their promise. Bierman and colleagues examined the implementation of the SDGs from three perspectives. A discursive perspective: to what extent do people talk about them? Normative: to what extent has there been legislative action? And institutional: to what extent have actual programs been implemented? And they concluded that in most cases, implementation of SDGs has been limited to talk, while action at a deeper regulatory and institutional level has been very limited. I will argue that the problem is not, at least not only due to financial or time constraints. The main problem is linked to unimplementability of the SDG implementation plans. Or in other words, implementation is framed in a way that enhances unimplementability. In both the context of the SDG and broader global policy development, implementation is often conceptualized through the lens of knowledge translation. This approach is grounded in several key assumptions. Firstly, it is viewed as a standardized process, drawing influence from translational research in drug regulation. And this is often illustrated by the so-called translational chain, where drugs undergo preclinical studies and animal testing before progressing to clinical trials, and then eventually being incorporated into clinical guidelines for regular use. Secondly, and related to the first point, this process is seen as technical and typically tracked through performance indicators and monitoring systems, as depicted in the so-called knowledge-to-action model. And thirdly, this process is considered to be consensus-oriented and politically neutral. While politics play a role in policy making, of course, they are generally not seen as part of the implementation phase. I suggest to see this understanding of implementation in the context of what Charles Briggs has called the paradox of incommunicability. Since the era of John Locke, misunderstandings, disagreements, and social and political turmoil resulting from the use of language have been linked to communication failures. And consequently, certain individuals and groups have been excluded from the realm of effective communication, labeled as unable to produce speech and action that reflect their status as enlightened, rational, and liberal beings. As Briggs explains, Locke decreed that only individuals who magically separate body and mind and speak in purely rational, disembodied, transparent, decontextualized, and disinterested fashion could save the world from confusion, discord, and disorder. But ironically, this perspective itself fosters further incommunicability, resulting in increased disagreements and misunderstandings. Building on Briggs' concept, Trish Greenhalgh and I challenge the paradox of unimplementability, which marginalizes specific individuals and groups by labeling them as unable to undertake actions in line with contemporary rational and liberal ideals. Unimplementability is viewed as a failure of the people expected to carry out the implementation. A knowledge translation approach results, therefore, in the marginalization of dissenting behaviors, labeling them as non-compliance or as failures to adapt to medical, educational, and other rationalities. And paradoxically, this perspective itself fosters unimplementability by resulting in increased disagreements and resistance. In the context of SDGs, the prevailing belief that their success depends on global commitment to roll out uncontested interventions has led to increased resistance. If a particular target is not reached within a given setting, and vaccine hesitancy is an obvious example here, certain populations are labeled as non-compliant and accused of failing to adapt to appropriate medical and educational rationalities. As a result, disagreements can no longer be productively explored, but are caught in a cycle of aggravated unimplementability. As an alternative to this translational science approach that leads to unimplementability, I suggest a translational health humanities approach. And this is an approach that engages with the political and ideological dynamics underpinning scientific principles, and views the development of scientific knowledge as a process deeply entwined with human interaction, political engagement, and intercultural mediation. More specifically, translational health humanities aims to challenge and enhance translation studies in medicine by incorporating theories of translation from the humanities, and to broaden the scope of translation studies within the humanities by applying these insights to new areas in the medical field, and by doing so, investigating their translatability. On a more fundamental level, this implies drawing attention to processes of mediation in medicine. Medicine necessarily involves an act of interpretation, bridging the gap between the realms of biology and the social and cultural environments in which humans exist. Hence, as emphasized by Kristeva and colleagues, all clinical encounters should be considered as cultural encounters in the sense that they involve translation between health as a biomedical phenomenon and healing as a lived experience. From this perspective, it becomes evident that implementation plans for the SDGs often overlook the complex cultural and political dynamics that play a crucial role in their effective translation. Implementation is first and foremost a question of human relationships and of communicative interactions, meaning that implementation is always involved with conflicts, with clashing interests, and with misunderstandings. And such factors are often ignored in SDG discourse. And when conflicts are mentioned, they simply figure as barriers or as obstacles or as hurdles to be overcome. And when faced with difficulty, the framing of each SDG is further compressed, a firm set of metrics for monitoring is further standardized, and a set of ideals is further enshrined as a branch of science. And in this manner, implementation becomes a depoliticizing political device. Particular stakeholders and priorities are emphasized at the expense of others. But this is done in the apparent name of reason and righteousness. As with any pensée unique, imposed conformity is presented as common sense, and non-compliance as backwardness and as futile resistance to a path to progress for which there is no real alternative. A translational health humanities approach aims to bring politics back into policy implementation. and thereby overcoming the impasse of false consensus and the challenge of unimplementability. It contains that if unimplementabilities are surfaced, discussed, and strategically harnessed, they can become a positive force, or what Chantal Mouffe refers to as agonistic pluralism, rather than descending into antagonism or open conflict. Let's consider an example. Vaccine hesitancy, recognized as one of the key obstacles to achieving SDG Target 3b on essential medicines and vaccines, is often dismissed as irrational or a result of incommunicability and an inability to align with contemporary rationalities. In our book Rethinking Evidence in the Time of Pandemics, Mona Baker and I argue that this approach risks increasing incommunicability and thereby compounding the problem of hesitancy rather than addressing its root causes. The dominant approach to vaccine hesitancy often fails to distinguish between scientific rationality and narrative rationality. While scientific rationality views the world as a set of logical puzzles that can be solved through appropriate analysis and application of reason conceived as an argumentative construct, narrative rationality perceives the world as a set of stories that must be chosen among to live the good life in a process of continual recreation. The key point is that when experts move beyond the immediate context where technical knowledge is evaluated scientifically and enter the complex everyday world, they must navigate the demands of narrative rationality. When a medical expert, for instance, engages in public discourse regarding pandemic-related measures, or in dialogue with patients about everyday health problems, he or she is obliged to leave the rationality of their technical community behind and submit to what are ultimately narrative criteria for deciding which of a range of competing narratives they are exposed to at any specific time is most worthy of believing and adhering to. A striking example comes from the controversy surrounding the AstraZeneca vaccine in 2021. Speaking on CTV on May 4, 2021, Dr. Quanch Tan, chair of the National Advisory Committee on Immunization in Canada, controversially admitted that risk cannot necessarily be calculated rationally. And she says that if, for instance, my sister was to get the AstraZeneca vaccine and die of a thrombosis when I know that it could have been prevented and that she's not in a high-risk area, I'm not sure that I could live with it. And she was later criticized for fueling fear and hesitancy through her statement. But on an epistemological level, her unguarded response reveals the extent to which medical discourse depends on narrative rationality, but at the same time struggle to make sense of it. While trying to defend, from the point of view of scientific rationality, the National Advisory Committee's decision to advise young people to wait for their preferred vaccine, she inadvertently admitted that what ultimately matters in practice is whether the decision to take or not take a specific vaccine is consistent with or speaks to people's lived experiences and its potential risk to loved ones rather than its overall risk assessment. This is about whether a person embedded in space and time and emotionally connected to others can live with a particular decision they have to make, not about assessment of risk in the disconnected and sanitized environment of the lab. Narrative probability and fidelity may be thought of as tests, that we apply, whether instinctively or through conscious reasoning, to decide whether a narrative coheres and offers good reasons for action and belief. Probability is about evaluating whether a story hangs together. Is it free of contradictions? Fidelity, on the other hand, is about assessing whether the story appears as credible, whether it rings true to a specific audience. The example of the AstraZeneca vaccine illustrates how incoherence or lack of probability in messaging can lead to confusion and erode public trust. Narrative fidelity, on the other hand, is judged by whether a story resonates with our lived experiences, which becomes particularly significant in the context of racial and other forms of discrimination. Recent studies highlight that vaccine hesitancy is notably prevalent within the Black community, likely rooted in a long history of structural racist systems that have resulted in health inequities and injustices. Morgan shows how this kind of reasoning influenced the response among people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups when the medical authorities proposed starting the vaccine rollout with the most vulnerable communities during the first wave of the pandemic. This caused concern among these communities because they are not normally at the front of the queue when it comes to the best medical treatments, particularly those in lower socioeconomic classes. Some people began to speculate that it was because it was an experimental vaccine and Black people were being used as guinea pigs. Morgan concludes that for some, this will have triggered alarm bells and brought up the many historical examples of Black people being used for experimental and unethical medical treatments. In my view, a more effective approach to vaccine hesitancy, rather than dismissing it as irrational or an expression of incommunicability, is to develop an understanding and empathy for others' stories and the values that these encode. And this involves assessing these narratives within the context of the universe in which these individuals live and operate, and recognizing the narrative fidelity of their stories, even when these stories conflict with the rationality of science. Based on the principles of translational health humanities, we can outline a narrative preparedness to address future challenges of unimplementability as follows. First, we must acknowledge that people can only make sense of data by incorporating it into narratives. Second, we must analyze the values underpinning competing stories about the same events in order to understand how different individuals and communities come to believe in one narrative account rather than another. And third, we must critically assess the probability of stories based on their values and principles and their fidelity. That is, whether they constitute good reason for belief or action from the perspective of a given individual or community. Narrative preparedness and the translational health humanities epistemology it reflects seeks to harness conflicts, clashing interests, and misunderstandings as essential and productive components of any mediation process. This approach aims to move beyond the deadlock of false consensus that often hampers the implementation of SDGs and broader policy initiatives. By engaging with diverse narratives and recognizing the values of these differing perspectives, this approach fosters a more dynamic and resilient process of policy development and implementation.